Well, good morning, brothers and sisters. It is nice to be with you. It is nice to get out and meet people and stand in front of people and talk to them again. It has been a long while since we've been able to do this regularly, isn't it? And Daz stumbled slightly as he was announcing it. And yes, my name's Peter. And yes, we will talk about the Apostle Peter this morning. And we're going to look at Peter walking with Jesus, and the number of times that he walks, his footsteps follow Jesus is amazing, and we can learn a lot from it. But can we just turn to Peter's first letter just for a moment, 1 Peter 2, because actually this is where we'll end. This is why I love this study. This is why I wanted to do it properly, because in 1 Peter 2, and verse 21, for to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps. And so it isn't just Peter who should follow in Jesus's footsteps, it is us as well. And what we have in Peter is an example of a man who literally followed Jesus. And what I hope we can do today is to think about how we can take lessons from how Peter did that, and the things that happened in his life. And maybe we can think about how we can apply those things in our lives as well. And so this morning we'll look at the earlier gospel records of Peter in around the Lake of Galilee primarily, and I can't remember how far I'm hoping to get. We're hoping to get to the Transfiguration and possibly slightly beyond. We'll see. In our second talk a little bit later this morning, we'll have a think about Peter. I've titled it In the Garden, and then have got sidetracked. So we will talk about him at the Last Supper and in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the time of his denial, and then that account in John 21 where he's by the Lake of Galilee again. And then our third talk will be him in the Acts, really, as a character, and how he moves through the Acts of the Apostles. And then we'll spend some time in Peter's letters and just see what he learned from his life, because he's done a lot of the work for us, really, which is great. We don't need to think what can we learn, because Peter tells us. And Peter's gospel, or Peter's record in the gospel, is bookended by the words "follow me." Really, he starts more or less by Jesus saying "follow me" as he stood by a lake, and he ends with Jesus saying "follow me" at the same lake. And it's nice. I almost think if you really put some effort in, could you find a center point in his gospel ministry? I don't know. It's beyond me. I certainly, by the time I had that thought, I didn't have time to follow that up. But I wonder whether there's a point that these things come in towards. He was, well, the first notes I wrote in this talk was Peter was from Capernaum, and then I reread John 1 and realized he wasn't from Capernaum, was he? He was from Bethsaida. We've just read it. But I think what happened was that he moved to Capernaum. There are various people will try and say, well, Bethsaida, it means fishing port fundamentally, doesn't it? I forget exactly, House of the Fish, I think. And there are some who will try and say, well, it was an area of Capernaum, but I'll come to this in a minute. But Capernaum is probably quite a small town, and so my feeling is that actually he was brought up in Bethsaida. That's where he lived when he was young, and he'd got married and he'd moved to Capernaum with his wife and his wife's family, and that was where he was living at the time of the gospel record. And I don't see any particular trouble with that. If we could just turn to Matthew chapter 4. I have in my mind still a question about Capernaum. So Matthew chapter 4 and verse 13. Verse 12, when Jesus heard that John had been put into prison, he departed to Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he came and dwelt in Capernaum, which is by the sea, in the regions of Zebulun and Naphtali, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by Isaiah the prophet, saying, the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and upon those who sat in the region and shadow of death, light has dawned. And the one slide that I sort of wanted to be able to show you today, and I can't, so we're going to have to imagine it. Okay, so we have the land of Israel, and we have Galilee at the top, and it looks something like that sort of shape, doesn't it? And if you look at any, I'm going to turn it down this way because I can't do that all the time. But so Galilee. So if you look at any map, you'll have Capernaum up there in the northwest corner. What does Matthew say? It says, and it's quoting obviously from the Old Testament, but the land of Zebulun, the land of Naphtali, by the way of the sea, beyond the Jordan. And I'm not convinced, actually, that Capernaum being here, it quite corresponds with, because the Jordan comes out more or less at the north there, with that description. Now I don't know, and I can't see any doubt in people's minds, but there is a slight part of me that wonders whether the archaeologists have quite got it right. They've dug up a town on that northwest corner, so there is definitely something there, and there was a fishing town there, but actually, it doesn't quite correspond with this idea of beyond the Jordan, I don't think. And we know that John was baptizing beyond the Jordan, and Bethabara, I think, is where he was done, and we know that we expect that to be over here on this side of the Jordan. So, it doesn't quite fit these two bits of scripture, and if I'm to believe one, I'm likely to believe the scriptures rather than the archaeologists. So it is possible that Capernaum isn't quite where the archaeologists tell us it is. And I haven't spent enough time looking at why they think it's there, but just out of interest, it's described as beyond the Jordan in Matthew chapter 4. And Peter had a house. He had a house in Capernaum. We read that in Mark chapter 1. We are going to be flicking around, I'm afraid. From time to time, I have this idea that I'm going to take all the and try and sort of in terms of the harmony of the Gospels, just lay it out, just so I can read all these things in chronological order. But too big a job, really, isn't it? Mark chapter 1, verse 29. Now, as soon as they had come out of the synagogue, they entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. But Simon's wife, mother, lay sick with a fever, and they told him about her at once. And so Peter has a house in Capernaum, so he's making himself a living. He has a mother-in-law. He must therefore have a wife, and I think he still has a wife. She's not mentioned at this point, is she? But she is mentioned later on. And when they come into this synagogue, when they come out of the synagogue and they come into the house, Peter's wife's mother is sick with a fever, and it says they told him about her at once. It doesn't quite read the same in the AV, does it? I think does it say anon they told her of her, but this is Peter and his brother and James and John being really excited about what Jesus could do, and saying, look, we need this help. She hasn't been able to come out this morning. She hasn't been able to come to the synagogue, and you can help her. And what do we have in verse 31? So he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her, and she served them. And I think that image that is reasonably early. Peter has spent a bit of time with Jesus at this point, but I think that image stays with her, and we will come back to that image later on. But yes, if we just turn to 1 Corinthians 9 for a minute, we just have that small mention of what is probably Peter's wife traveling with him. So 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 5, Paul says in his own defense, do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas? And Cephas being Peter, the Aramaic word for stone. And potentially Peter at this time is taking his wife with him as he travels and preaches, and so although we don't have her recorded in the Gospels, we know that she must have been supportive, at least later on, and I imagine at this point, because she's just seen Jesus heal her mother, and that's got to have an impact on her, doesn't it? So Peter's family was reasonably supportive at the very least, is what I take from this. And so we're going to have a look at Peter's meetings with Jesus, initial meetings, and that's why we had John chapter 1 read for us. because that's the record of the first meeting that Peter has with Jesus. And so we have Jesus at this point. He has been baptized and he's been out into the wilderness for 40 days. And it seems that this account in John 1 verse 29, when John sees Jesus coming towards him, this is Jesus's return from the wilderness. And this is him coming back into the land and being ready to start his ministry. And John has with him his disciples, and he is with two of them. There we go, verse 35. Verse 29, John sees him and he says, he gives this account of what happened 40 days ago. And then in verse 35, the next day, John stood with two of his disciples. And we know one of those is Andrew, who is Peter's brother. And the assumption is that the second one was John, because John doesn't tend to name himself. We don't know that for certain, but it sounds sensible, don't we? We know that that Peter, Andrew, James and John had a working relationship and knew each other. And it is entirely possible that was John. And John the Baptist looks at Jesus and says, "Behold, the Lamb of God." And he's told his two disciples, what's happened. They've had this account in verse 34 that John had seen and testified that this is the Son of God. So they knew that. And the two disciples in verse 37 heard John speak and they followed Jesus. Although it's not quite that quick, is it? So verse 40, one of the two who heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. And he first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We found the Messiah," which is translated the Christ. And so Andrew goes and gets Peter. And what are they going to do? Well, verse 38, what Andrew and John say to him is, "Where are you staying?" And it's an interesting question, because presumably he wasn't really staying anywhere at this point. He hadn't been in the area for 40 days. And so where had Jesus slept the night before? But we don't know, do we? But in all likelihood, it was a small shelter or something like that. He hadn't got a house where he lived, or lots of people he knew in the area. He was traveling through it. So was he literally underneath a tree, or underneath we'd use a tarpaulin today, wouldn't we? I don't know what they had, but had he got some kind of temporary shelter that he was staying in? What was it that Andrew and Peter and John went to and stayed with him for that day? And on this day, in verse 42, and Andrew brought Peter to Jesus. Now when Jesus looked at him, he said, "You are Simon, the son of Jonah. You shall be called Cephas," which is translated a stone. And so that's his name in Aramaic and in Greek. He's Cephas and he's Peter, and that's what he became. And it's an interesting responsibility, I suppose, to have had your name changed by Jesus, and to I don't know whether this was explained to him. You're going to be a rock. You'd be thinking, well, is that a compliment? Is that an insult? We don't have any explanation at this point, do we? And I wonder what Peter thought of that you're going to be called the rock, and what he felt he was going to have to do because of that. And we don't know at this point, I don't think, what happened there. And I have completely lost my place in my notes. There we go. And this point, I think, he's being called as a disciple. There are three times where Peter is called, ultimately, I think. And this one is Andrew has gone out and he's used the word rabbi, teacher. And so Peter and Andrew and John are presenting themselves as his disciples. They are here to learn from him. And when they sat and they sat with him where he was staying, they were sitting there to learn from him. They will be absorbing his message, and they were presumably the first people to learn the gospel message in any respects. They were the first people to have it taught to them, because this was the start of Jesus's ministry. He now had the Spirit of God, and he was going to use that to teach people. And so they were the very first people to hear this message. And it is those three who are with him time and time again. They were his first disciples, and they were the ones he turned to in times of trouble. And it must have been, presumably, he found having them there comforting, and because he repeated that time and time again. And so for Jesus, this was I'm going to say special moment. This was an important moment when he had these 3 disciples with him for the very first time. And from here, Jesus and the others, they head back towards Galilee, and they head straight into the wedding in Cana. It was the 3rd day after this, and they go straight into this wedding. And I don't know quite what the people at the wedding thought. Had he been invited? Had they all been invited? I appreciate there's probably a family relationship with Jesus, and probably James and John, and I guess Peter had been invited as well. But he'd been away for 40 days. He'd been disappeared. What were they expecting at the wedding when he came? And he did, and he came, and he performed this sign. And presumably his mother hadn't seen him for 40 days as well. And she suddenly comes to him and says, "You need to do this. You need to help." And it's interesting, isn't it, when you start to put it together chronologically? It makes the story more interesting, and to some extent, it makes you think about the people who were there. And then the second time Peter gets called. So Luke chapter 5. So Luke chapter 5, verse 1, so it was, as the multitude pressed about him to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake of Gennesaret and saw 2 boats standing by the lake, but the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. And he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little from land. And he sat down and he taught the multitudes from the boat. When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, "Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." But Simon answered and said to him, "Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." And so they had been fishing all night, and in a way, I think that was probably a miracle of its own, that they hadn't managed to catch anything. You sort of assume that these are people who are experienced fishermen on a lake, and they would know where and how to catch fish. So certainly there was some miraculous provision of an empty net at this point, so that Jesus could then provide them with a full net in a few minutes. And so Jesus had arranged it so he came at exactly the right time. And Jesus, so in verse 3, it said he sat down and he taught the multitudes from the boat. And it's slightly odd, isn't it? I would have expected him to be stood and maybe stood on the seat or something, so he was that little bit higher, so people could see him properly. But it says he sat down to teach them, and it's very specific. And it doesn't say at any point that he gets back up again. And so the record continues in verse 6. When they'd done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. There were so many fish in there, it was starting to split apart. And verse 7, so they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." And so where was Jesus at this time? Was he still sat in the boat? Because if he was still sat down, then suddenly this boat is filled with fish, and he's got fish all around him. And it's odd, isn't it? It's why are we told that he sat down, and then why are we not told that he stood up? And I think I don't feel strongly either way. I don't think I think I would sort of assume he was stood up and keeping out the way, or maybe even helping. Who knows? But this boat is full of fish. And what does Peter do then? He fell down at Jesus's knees. And so whether Jesus is stood or sitting, Peter is now immersing himself in these fish. He's got fish all around him because the boat was full, hasn't he? And he's going to be a fisher of men. And when we come to Pentecost later on, he'll have converts all around him, won't he? He'll be surrounded by these fish that he's going to catch. But he starts on his knees, surrounded by fish at Jesus's knees, doesn't he? And he's worried. He can't quite understand it at this point. So verse 8, when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I'm a sinful man, O Lord." And at this point, he he can't quite cope with the idea of what Jesus is doing. It worries him. And so he's at this point, he's even asking Jesus to stay away from him. And it's not a reaction we see later, is it? Or possibly it is. But it's that start of Peter sort of instinctively reacting to things and showing us his true character. And it scares him so much. It's so much out of his comfort zone that he says, "Depart from me." It is his first action. And this is the second time that he's called and told to help. So verse 10. So verse 9, he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish. Verse 10, so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will catch men." So when they brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. And so this time they're called to work with Jesus. They're called to be companions with Jesus, aren't they? This is no longer just learning from him. This is working with him. And that is what they would do as we go through the gospel message. And verse 11, they brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. If we turn back to Matthew chapter 4, it expounds that a little bit. Matthew 4, verse 18, and Jesus, walking by the Sea of Galilee, saw two brothers, Simon called Peter, and Andrew his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." They immediately left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother, in the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets. He called them, and immediately they left their boat and their father and followed him. And I don't know whether this is the first part of this is this first section that we read in Luke, whether this is Jesus walking along and then getting into the boat, and Matthew ignores the getting in the boat bit, or whether maybe Jesus came back in and he wandered off for a little bit. He went and prayed or have a rest or did whatever he felt necessary while the boats were emptied and the catch was dealt with. And then maybe he came back walking along the boat, the beach, and this is where he calls them a second time. But this is where he says, "This is the time where you need to follow me." And this is that moment where Peter and Andrew and James and John, that they immediately leave their nets and follow him, don't they? And this is the point where you get that idea of Peter's following in the footsteps of Jesus, because there was a beach or something here, wasn't there? This was at the side of the lake, and literally they would be able to see Jesus's footsteps as he carried on along the sand, wouldn't they? And Peter and Andrew and James and John were going to literally follow in his footsteps. The poem which I'm sure we've all heard from time to time of, there are two footsteps across the beach and then they become one, because that is where Jesus is carrying you. Well, literally, Peter could have walked in Jesus's footsteps, and I love that idea, because, as I say, he tells us that's what we need to do as well. That Peter was willing to immediately leave his livelihood behind him and go and follow and work with Jesus at this point. And that is certainly something that we can have in mind, that's what we need to do. We need to look to Jesus and the things that he did and follow him without hesitation and do those same things. If we come to Luke chapter 6, we see that Jesus made a third calling, didn't he? And this is when he called his apostles to him. So Luke 6 verse 12. Now it came to pass in those days that he went out into the mountain to pray and continued all night in prayer. And when it was day, he called his disciples to himself. And from them he chose 12, whom he also named apostles: Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became a traitor. And so we have Jesus selecting the 12 apostles. And so this is the third calling, and they're going to be people who would do Jesus's work on the earth and would speak in the name of Jesus, weren't they? And these were the 12 who did it. And no matter which list you have, Simon Peter is always going to be the first in the list. because Simon Peter did take a leading role amongst them. And he's not ready for it yet, and he doesn't always get it quite right yet. And we'll look at that over the next few minutes. But Peter is always listed first, and Judas is always listed last. And between them, the others vary in their order. But Peter was called to a particular role, a special role, and we'll come to that a little bit later as well. And so yes, we have Peter then, who has left his house and left his family behind him. And Jesus, just thinking back to that his house and that time that Jesus went to Peter's house. Jesus didn't ask about Peter's mother-in-law, did he? So Jesus knew everything, and God knows everything, but we are commanded to ask him for help. And that's one of the lessons that is probably worth us noting, that Peter had to ask Jesus for help in healing his mother-in-law, and Jesus did it immediately, but we do need to ask as well. Right, if we could go to Mark chapter 4, because we're going to have a look at two storms, because I think Peter has a lot to learn about his life as a disciple in Christ. And he's a special person, and he will have a special role. I've said that already, but Peter has things to learn, and all the disciples do as well, for that matter. And we're going to look at the two storms on the lake in which the disciples were out in a boat, and we're going to see what it is that Peter learned, because we can see him learning as these things happen. And so verse 35 of Mark chapter 4, on the same day when evening had come, Jesus said to them, let us cross over to the other side. And so this is Jesus's idea, is the first thing we need to note, don't we? That possibly the disciples thought better of it. They could see that maybe they could see this storm rolling in, and they knew that maybe this wasn't the best time to be crossing the lake. But Jesus said, let us go across, and so they did. And so Jesus led them in their way across the lake. And verse 36, now when they had sent away the multitude, so the disciples have to get rid of the crowd first, they took him along in the boat as he was, and the other little boats were also with him. So they take him, they help him on board, it sounds like, don't they? They set him down on what is assumed to be a pillow or a cushion, so where he will fall asleep, and they settle him into the boat while the experienced fishermen will man the boat across the lake. And maybe there is in that idea, the idea that they knew that this wasn't the best time, and this storm was on its way. And so, yeah, in verse 37, this great storm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that it was already filling. But Jesus, was in the stern asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? And they were absolutely terrified, weren't they? And so they said, don't you care? You've made us do this. Don't you care that this is what's happening? Are you just going to sleep there and ignore us? And in a sense, that makes sense if it was his idea to go across the storm. And possibly they'd even said, are you sure? Because it looks a bit dark, cloudy over there. But they're blaming Jesus for this, it seems. And what does Jesus do? In verse 39, then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And so that was what that was what he did to help them. But I suppose, to my mind, the question is, what is it that they actually asked him for? Because do you think at this point the disciples were asking him to calm the storm? I suspect not. And if we go to Psalm 107, I think Psalm 107 seems to describe this event almost exactly. So Psalm 107, verse 23, those who go down to the sea in ships, who do business on great waters. They see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. So those who go down to the sea in ships, so there were multiple ships on this occasion, weren't there? There was lots of little ships with him. Those who do business on great waters, well, I think that describes, Peter, Andrew, James, and John on the Sea of Galilee, doesn't it? And they're going to see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. They're going to see this immense storm that came on them, and they could see that this was a particularly bad storm, and this was the power of God that had caused the storm. So verse 25, for he commands and raises the stormy wind, which lifts up the waves of the sea. They mount up to the heavens, they go down again to the depths. Their soul melts because of trouble. They reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man and are at their wits' end. And I think that describes where the disciples were to a T, doesn't it? They were at their wits' end. They tried their very best to get through without trying to disturb Jesus. They'd done their best, but for hours they'd been going right up and right down and right up again. And they were terrified. They were at their wits' end. And so what do? Verse 28, they cry out to the Lord in their trouble, and he brings them out of their distresses. He calms the storm. So they were distressed. And what did Jesus say? Peace, be still. And he said it, I think, to the storm, but he said it to the disciples as well. Because they needed peace and they needed to be still, didn't they? They were reeling to and fro and staggering like drunken men, but Psalms tells us it. And as I say, I think that it describes it to a T. But let's just carry on a little bit in Psalms. Verse 29, he calms the storm so its waves are still. Verse 30, then they are glad because they are quiet, so he guides them to their desired haven. And so I think that what the disciples had been asking for was to get to the other side, because the only way out of this storm that they could see was to get to land. That was how they survived these storms. They got to land. They got out of the boat, they got off the sea, and they pulled the boats up out of the way, and they were safe. That was the fisherman's place of safety, the shore, wasn't it? But that wasn't what Jesus gave them, and that's what Psalms tells us. So he calmed the storm and he made the waves still, and he calmed the disciples and made them still. But then he took them where they wanted to be. And that's what happens in Mark, that they then come to the other side. So chapter 5, verse 1, then they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gadarenes. And so that was what they had, that they were absolutely terrified, but Jesus calmed the storm and gave them their peace. And I like the link here with Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4, verse 6 says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. So when you're scared, ask God, pray about it. And the difference between a true believer and one who doesn't really know, well, it's the next verse. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Because people in the world, they would expect that if you pray to God and say, get me to the shore, that he will take you to the shore. That's their expectation, that God is a magician or God is a genie. You ask him for a wish and you get there. But that is not the message of the scriptures, is it? God is righteous and God is a true judge, and God knows all things. And so God knew and Jesus knew in Mark chapter 4 what it was that the disciples needed. They needed peace, and that is what God promises us as well. And I think that's a lovely idea, and that works really well for me in terms of what do we expect in our lives? Well, we pray to God for help, and what he will give us is peace. And it doesn't matter how he gives us that peace. He gives us peace, and that is a wonderful thing, isn't it? But it is a change from the human attitude. But we then have the second storm. In Matthew chapter 14. And this time the disciples behave differently. So Matthew 14, verse 22, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. So this is slightly different. Jesus is forcing them. So again, he encouraged them strongly last time, but this time he's forcing them, and that does seem to be what the word means. He's making them go across the sea. And this time it's Jesus who will turn the multitudes away. Well, why did he do that? They'd come to him and they wanted to make him king. It's John chapter 6. We won't turn there because we seem to be moving quickly, that clock. So John chapter 6 says they wanted to make him king, and the disciples, well, they wanted him to be king as well, didn't they? They didn't yet understand that he wasn't going to be king at this time. And so Jesus had to get his disciples out of the way. So he puts them in a boat and he pushes them out and says, go on, I'll catch you up. Because Jesus has to deal with this. This is his temptation, isn't it? This is one of those temptations that he had in the wilderness, that he could take the kingship early. But he's dealt with that and he's prepared for that. So that's okay. So Jesus can deal with this by himself, because he's already brought to mind the scriptures that will help him with this. And so Jesus forces them out of the way, because otherwise they were going to do something stupid, no doubt. And Jesus knew it before they did. This time, verse 20, if we come down to verse 24, again, verse 24, the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled. So this time they weren't scared by this storm. And I don't know whether it wasn't quite as bad as last time. I suspect it probably wasn't. It doesn't sound quite so bad, does it? But they were stuck in the middle of the sea. They couldn't make any further because the wind was against them. And this time they're terrified when they see this figure walking towards them. And I'm happy it wasn't Jesus that scared them. It was just that they could see something coming towards them. That was what terrified them. And if we come down to, well, verse 27, but immediately Jesus spoke to them saying, be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid. Now they know it's him, that's fine. Verse 28, Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. So Peter's attitude has changed. The first time he wanted to be at the shore, and it didn't matter that Jesus was there in the boat with him. What he needed was to be at the shore. But this time what he needs is to be with Jesus, isn't it? And it doesn't matter that Jesus is across the waves. He's on the water. Peter just wants to be with him because that is now where Peter feels safe. And so Peter's learned a lot from that first storm, hasn't he? And we can learn the same, that being with Jesus should be our safe place. That we shouldn't be trying to sort these things on our own and make our own way to the shore. We should want to be with Jesus, even if that requires us walking on water. And what a ridiculous idea it seems, isn't it? Walking on water. How did it happen? What was it like? So were the waves still going up and down, or were they almost frozen in place? I find it sometimes I trip over on level ground. If the waves are going up and down, what's he doing? It's you can't imagine it. And I really hope we can get an answer to that in the kingdom. It would be fantastic, wouldn't it? It's an amazing idea. But yeah, it's really difficult. And what happens? Well, verse 30. So verse 29, Jesus says, come, and Peter came down from the boat and walked on the water to go to Jesus. But verse 30, when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. And so the wind was whipping up the waves, and they were coming towards him, and maybe it was getting rougher. But he was afraid. He was scared. And suddenly this immense faith that he had, and it was immense, because I just can't imagine taking that first step. It's just beyond me. But Peter did it. And let's not, we see his faith failing him so often in the Gospels, and this was one of them, isn't it? But it isn't that it was a failure. It was so great to begin with that when he came back down to our level, it sort of seems bad, doesn't it? And so he stepped out onto the water, and then the waves were becoming greater, and so he starts to panic, and he is afraid, and he needs Jesus to save him. But it's Jesus he calls to this time, isn't it? And that again is an improvement, isn't it? And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And he isn't little faith, is he? And we've just said that. And the word doesn't mean little. There's all sorts of ways it can be translated if you look at Strong's, and it's sort of almost is one of them. So you have almost faith. You've almost there, aren't you? You have brief faith. You have seasonal faith. And these are all, really nice ideas, aren't they? That his faith was absolute for a given time, and then he just has those moments of panic. And we'll see it's always when he's afraid. It says he's afraid so many times, and that's what happens to him, unfortunately. That these things just become too great, and we can completely understand that, can't we? So I'm not in a, I think just having that, the word little faith, it's bothered me a little bit previously, but seasonal faith, alternating faith, brief faith, I can completely cope with that. So moments of brilliance, moments of normality in Peter's case. And so immediately, again, Jesus puts out his hand, just like he had to Peter's mother-in-law, and he lifts Peter back up, and they go back to the boat together. And again, was Peter walking in Jesus's footsteps, literally following him across the waves? Come on, this is I'll show you the smooth path through these waves. Was it slippery as well? I don't know, but I will show you the path to walk. And again, Jesus is literally, so he's gone from the beach and he's going across the sea now in the footsteps of Jesus. And again, Peter says in his letter that's what we need to do, isn't it? How close do we need to be on time? What time are we starting again? 11.
We can drop it back.
Okay, so I'm going to do then. We'll go to
3 hours for building this half, which we won't need.
That's fine. Excellent.
But that doesn't mean you can have 3 hours extra.
We can do more spiritual walking, and then we can do less walking with bills, can't we? So how's that? Matthew chapter 16 then, because Matthew chapter 16 has Peter's greatest and Peter's worst. I'm turning the wrong way. Has Peter's greatest and worst things that he said almost next to each other. I think is what happens here. Verse 15. So Jesus had said, he's talking to his disciples, "Who do man say that I, the Son of Man, am?" The John the Baptist, Elijah, some said Jeremiah, some one of the prophets. Verse 15, "Who do you say that I am?" And St. Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." He's got it, hasn't he? You are the Messiah, and you are the Son of God. You are the Son of the living God, he says. He's got it entirely right, hasn't he? And what does Jesus say? "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." And that was what God announced, wasn't it? On the day of Jesus' baptism, "This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased." It was Jesus was the Son of God, and Peter had that down. He understood that. And Andrew had gone to Peter and said, we found the Messiah. And Peter's got that as well. And so Peter is a prophet at this point, that God has revealed to him. So he absolutely knows that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And this was in terms of his speech in the Gospels, this is the pinnacle of what Peter says. And so Jesus says, "I tell you that you are Peter, you are a rock, and on this rock, this statement that you've just made, will I build my church. My ecclesia will be built on this foundation, that I am the Son of God, and that I am the Messiah." And there's so much more that we need to slot into that, he says, but that is the foundation. If you believe in me, then we're starting on the right foundation. And you know what? No, death will not be able to prevail against it, is what he says. And so, that is Jesus's absolute high point, wasn't it? But then it goes wrong, and it goes so very badly wrong. So verse 21, "From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised the third day." And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me. You are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men." And, this is Peter he is an adversary of Jesus at this point. He's working against Jesus at this point. That Peter was trying to persuade Jesus, and again, this harks back to Jesus' temptations, doesn't it? This is one of the things that Jesus wanted, to be able to avoid, to take a shortcut to the kingdom, and to avoid the pain and suffering. Jesus absolutely wanted to avoid it, and Peter's tempting him to do it again, isn't he? And Peter is Satan. Peter is an adversary, and Jesus says, "You are an offense to me if you are not mindful of the things of God." And Peter had incredible faith, but he still hadn't quite got it right, had he? And how far, how much can we bear that in mind, that we can't put our own plans on God's purpose. We can try our hardest to do the things that we think are right, but we must be guided by those things that God puts in our lives to shepherd us to the right place, to force us through the right narrow path that he wants us to take. And Peter has gone from absolute brilliance, from a prophet to an adversary in 3 verses. It's amazing, isn't it? And we need to be aware of that and be mindful of that, I think. Matthew chapter 25. I wanted to finish on a little bit of a practical note, and we'll finish with the parable of the talents. Because I think the parable of the talents, it reminds me of Peter. And we have this parable, and why do we have different amounts? So we know the story, don't we? The husbandman is going away, and he leaves his 3 servants with treasure. 5 talents, massive amount of money. 2 talents, massive amount of money. 1 talent, still a massive amount of money, but less than the others. And you've got these servants given these treasures, and what do they do with them, and why are they different amounts? And I think it's maybe, there's a hint, certainly as you think of Peter in this context, it's how you value the truth to some extent. And so Peter put the teachings of Jesus, it had immense value to him, didn't he? And because it had immense value, and he can see how great it was, he wasn't scared to use it. And so he wasn't scared to walk on the water. And he wasn't scared to declare Jesus was the Messiah. And wrongly, he wasn't scared to say to Jesus that you don't need to go through these sufferings and die. And because he had such a great treasure, he could afford to share it with everybody, couldn't he? And in fact, he could almost not afford to not share it with everybody. But you know what I mean? It's I've got this, and I need to share it because it's just so great and so much that I have to do this. And that, of course, is the right attitude. He had 5 talents, and he was going to share it, and look at the reward he got for it, and look at all these things that happened because of it. And he absolutely used all that treasure that he'd been given, didn't he? And there would be others. So we don't know, do we? But the other disciples, they knew they had a treasure, and they were going to work really hard for Jesus. And I'm not in any way denigrating them and saying they weren't quite as great, but maybe we can equate those with those who had 2 talents. It was worth it to them, but it didn't make them behave in quite such a expansive way as Peter did it. And then we have the person with 1 talent, and that, relatively speaking, is a small treasure. And that servant thinks that he needs to hold on to it. He's scared for it, isn't he? And bear with me, this is, I am not being critical, but I think it's an interesting way we can think. We've had some asylum seeker visitors at Cannock recently. Most of them speak Farsi. And the biggest trouble we've had with this generally is the really small things. So for example, we don't have any of them who is competent enough to speak, to translate. And so we've been using automatic subtitles, so Microsoft Translate, and we've put a television. So we've moved the platform across, the table thing across a bit, and there's a television just here with subtitles on. And now, relatively speaking, it's a really small adjustment, isn't it? But it just takes us away from our comfort zone a little bit. And that shouldn't really bother us, should it? But it has bothered people, and I appreciate it is for them a bother, but it's a small thing, and it's people maybe who don't realise quite what a greatness they have. But it's coming to the meeting is comfortable, isn't it? It's something to be kept at its ease, because this is a comfortable, safe space. And that isn't what should be important. What should be important is this great treasure that allows us to have the power of God behind us, and to do God's will in the world, and to spread his word, and to help people gain a place in the kingdom. But maybe this attitude of this man with one talent is that, do you know what this is? I haven't got enough to share, and I need to be careful and look after this. And it says, does it say verse 25? I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, there, have what is yours. I kept it the same. Look, we haven't changed it. It's still comfortable. It's the same as it's been for years. We don't need to change this. We've been doing it for years. And do you know what I mean? And I'm not the same about the television, which is why I notice it. I'm sure I'm the same about other things. So I'm in no way criticizing other people, but it's exactly what this person says. I was afraid. And people are afraid that I've moved the it was me who did it, you see. I moved the table, I put the television there, and they're afraid because of it. And I'm going to say there are things that we all think that are ridiculous, aren't there? And what this man with one talent has, that was ridiculous. But that was Peter sometimes as well, wasn't it? That it suddenly, I can't do this, I can't do it anymore. I'm afraid. But the upsetting thing about this parable is that he didn't need to be afraid about it, because this talent wasn't going to be taken away from him. Because when it is taken away from him, because he's behaved wrongly, it's given to the man who has 10 talents. So this man who had 5 talents to start with and grew it to 5 more talents, he hasn't had to give any of that back to his master. He's just been praised for what he did. So he is the man with 10 talents. None of it's been taken from him. So those 5 talents were his to do with what he wanted with. And the 2 talents likewise, and the 1 talent. That man had been given 1 talent, and it was his to do absolutely what it was with, what he wanted with it. And he didn't have to hide it, because it was his. So if he lost it, nobody else was losing out. And I think there is something of a lesson from Peter here, that we need to make sure that we understand that the treasure that we have is so big that there is plenty to share. And we can afford to share it with other people, and we have to share it with other people, don't we? And so, thank you for listening. I apologise. Well, we started late anyway. I'm blaming that. But we are. But yes, thank you for listening. And as I say, we're going to look at Peter growing as we do so. And yes, thank you for listening.